Diversity management. Last week, we had the opportunity to talk about individual social identities and how those identities intersect with one another in order to create unique experiences for employees. And the ways in which our identities intersect, the types of identities that we have, they influence our workplace experiences. They influence whether or not we might feel inclined to hide or conceal some of those identities. And really, it just shapes our worldview, it shapes our values, and those identities really are the foundation for not only understanding why organizations aren't inclusive, but for forging a path ahead in order to make the workplace a more inclusive place. So, I did just want to touch on quickly, you'll see there are some slides in this slide deck related to disclosure. A point that wasn't included in the PowerPoint last week, but I think is important to bring up is that you might be in a situation where you disclose an identity to someone else, but you might also be in a position where someone discloses to you. Particularly in the field of HR, employees are going to bring all kinds of issues, perspectives, experiences to you. And it's really important to be prepared for the fact that someone might be disclosing information to you. So I wanted to just quickly include some information about what you should say in a disclosure experience. So it's really important to acknowledge the disclosure. So you might say something like, I appreciate you disclosing this information to me, or I appreciate you trusting me with this information. So acknowledging that this might be a difficult experience or that a disclosure actually has occurred. I think it's really important to also say thank you. So something along the lines of, thank you for sharing this information with me. Thank you for trusting me with this information. It really just goes above to show that you are empathetic and that you are open-minded and that you recognize truly what a difficult process it can be for someone to disclose. It's also really important to remain calm and neutral. This can occur if, particularly if we have feelings or emotions or prejudice or bias against a certain identity. So if someone tells us something, that we remain calm and neutral, that we don't get angry or we don't get overly excited, right? We want to maintain this professional demeanor, and being calm will also enable that other person to continue to feel more comfortable. You might also ask, how can I support you? So thank you very much for telling me about this. Is there anything that I can do to further support you in your role or in the workplace? Is there anything that you need from me? And I think this is really important because it shows not only that you recognize disclosure has occurred and you recognize the importance of that disclosure, but you're going one step beyond to support this individual or asking for how you can support them. But it's also necessary to cover a few things that we should not do in reaction to disclosure. So do not offer judgment, whatever the disclosure may be. If it's someone's sexual orientation, if it's related to a disability, if it's related to substance use, whatever it might be, it's necessary to just hold your opinion to yourself. So not offering any judgment about whether someone should do something or shouldn't do something, or if you think that's a good identity or not a good identity, not necessary. Also, I wouldn't jump to trying to provide solutions for individuals because sometimes they might not see that their identity is causing them any problems. And so we don't want to assume that just because someone has an identity that they've kept concealed, that all of a sudden it's an issue that we need to solve, right? That's not helpful and also might come across very negative to that individual and threatening. So if somebody tells you that they've been having a hard time with alcohol use and that they, are letting you know about this, you shouldn't immediately jump to telling them about rehab or about AA support groups, right? You just don't want to go to where you're providing solutions, but rather letting them drive the questions, letting them drive the conversation. And that's why when you can ask how to support them, let them tell you exactly what they need rather than you impressing upon them. And then, it's really important that we don't center the conversation around ourselves. Sometimes we try to draw back on our own experiences in order to create bonds with other people, or to show that we have connections with them, or that we have similarities. So if somebody were to disclose that they had a miscarriage, and this happens quite commonly, it's important that you don't jump into your own story and talk about how maybe you would have experienced a pregnancy loss and what it meant to you and how traumatic that is. All that information is important, and it might come at another time if you're comfortable sharing. But at that moment, when it's their disclosure experience, their disclosure event, it's really helpful to let them be the person of interest, let them be the person guiding the conversation, and to not make it seem like it's all about us, even if we do have similarities, or even if we do believe we've had some shared experiences. And then, of course, don't ask any probing or invasive questions. So if somebody tells you that they've been experiencing depression and that they've been seeing a counselor, you just take that information. Again, thank you for telling me. I appreciate you sharing that information with me. Is there anything I can do to support you? That's all you really need to do. You don't want to ask, well, how long have you been depressed? And why are you depressed? And are you taking medication? And these questions that really can make somebody feel uncomfortable. And, as humans, we have a tendency to be naturally curious, and that curiosity is okay. But we don't want to unleash it in these types of situations where somebody's already vulnerable, can make them feel much more uncomfortable. And then, it's important to recognize, again, that somebody might share information with you that might make you feel uncomfortable, or maybe, again, we're talking this week about bias, about stigma, and these things are real, and we all have biases. And how do we react? How do we contain those reactions? So if you're uncomfortable, it's really important to do your own research about a particular identity, about a particular group of individuals, to better understand their experiences and their perspectives. And it's really helpful to find some ally role models. So look to leaders in your organization that are true role models for diversity and inclusion, and have conversations with them, and ask how maybe they have overcome some of their own challenges related to diversity and inclusion, and take these as opportunities to learn from individuals who are already representing DEI in a positive way. And I think this is really important. Truth to be had is that we need to recognize our emotions and how we might feel about somebody, or about somebody coming out about a particular identity. It's not the responsibility of the person coming to us, right? It's not the responsibility of the person who's disclosing to help deal with our emotions, right? It's our responsibility to deal with those emotions. So if somebody told you that they were having a hard time with substance abuse, and maybe you have particular negative feelings towards individuals that use drugs, it's not up to that person. It's not their responsibility to manage your negative emotions, right? As a professional, you need to remain calm and recognize that maybe you are feeling some negative emotions or feelings, and come to a way of dealing with that on your own, rather than putting that back on your employees. So it's a challenging process. It's not easy. We're going to learn all about that this week, how difficult it can be to manage bias and to recognize it and accept that we all have it. But that's part of the journey. So I just wanted to take a moment to just, give you a clear definition of diversity in the workplace, because we haven't yet really had this clear focus on what diversity means. So when we're talking about workplace diversity, it's the division of the workplace into distinction categories. And so these distinction categories are those that have a perceived commonality within a given cultural or national context. So some group of individuals belong to a category that have this shared characteristic or commonality. And that impact potentially harmful or beneficial employment outcomes, such as job opportunities, treatment in the workplace, and promotion aspects, irrespective of job-related skills and qualifications. So what we're really talking about are these commonalities, these characteristics, these identities that are shared by a group. And that commonality, that characteristic, that identity can lead to potentially harmful or beneficial employment outcomes. So, historically speaking, gender has been a differentiating factor in the workplace, right? Groups of men have been grouped by being male, and groups of women have been grouped by being female, and that's that shared commonality or characteristic. And generally, historically, men have benefited, right, in terms of opportunities and networking and being perceived as leaders, whereas women have often been stereotyped as not leader-like, as being too emotional, as not being part of the club, right? And they miss out on job opportunities or networking opportunities. So we can see how we really want to talk about identities that matter, right? If you have this week, we're going to talk about blue eyes and brown eyes. You're going to watch a video, but in the workplace, having blue eyes is not a commonality that's important for workplace outcomes. So yes, we want to pay attention to individuals' identities, but we really want to hone in on those that are most important. So whether or not you like to bike or you like to run, sure, those are shared interests, but they're not really important for workplace outcomes. So for this semester, we want to focus on those characteristics or aspects of diversity that have a major impact on job-related outcomes and opportunities. So we spent some time last week setting up this foundation about identities and why they're important and how they shape workplace experiences. And really, we focus on those identities because oftentimes they are the reason why individuals experience negative workplace interactions, why they have negative workplace experiences in general. And so we're going to focus on 3 particular negative outcomes. Those are stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. We use these terms a lot in just regular language, common language day to day, but these are unique characteristics. They're unique phenomena that occur. It's important to understand the distinction between these 3 things. And we're going to understand how stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination lead to differential or negative outcomes for certain individuals in certain identity groups. And then as we build throughout the semester, we'll work to undo some of these negative outcomes. So what can we do to overcome some of these tendencies towards stereotypes or prejudice? How can we intervene to minimize discrimination from occurring? So we'll start by talking about stereotypes. And stereotypes are standardized, oversimplified mental pictures that is held in common by members of a group. So these are more or less mental shortcuts that we employ. We assume that all individuals of a particular group engage in this kind of behavior or have this kind of characteristic, and we're basically using a shortcut, a mental shortcut, and applying it to everybody. For instance, a common stereotype, right, is that women are bad drivers. And I pick this because I think it's not quite as emotionally laden as some of the other stereotypes that exist out there. But generally, there's this belief that women are bad drivers. So if you're a woman, you must be a bad driver. So we take this characterization and we extend it to all individuals in that group. But I do want to recognize that stereotypes can actually be positive or negative. So there's a theoretical paradigm in the field of diversity management, in organizational behavior, and it's called the stereotype content model. So this model is really looking at the nature of stereotypes, and it says stereotypes can be positive or negative. So we can apply positive stereotypes to groups or negative stereotypes to groups. And it tends to center around 2 main characteristics, warmth and competence. So these are the 2 contents that are included in the stereotype content model. So warmth is the extent to which a group is perceived as friendly, trustworthy, or likable. So thinking about groups in society, which groups do we tend to ascribe these kinds of characteristics to? Generally speaking, we tend to assume women are higher on warmth than men, right? They're more friendly, they're more likable. We tend to ascribe warmth characteristics to the elderly, right? Elderly individuals are friendly and they're likable. So we can apply these stereotypes to broad groups. Competence tends to involve these perceptions of whether a group is intelligent, are they efficient, are they assertive, and generally speaking, we assume some groups in society are more competent than others. We certainly see this in the workplace playing out with who gets promotions and who doesn't. So just very broadly, we tend to ascribe higher competence perceptions to white individuals than to groups of individuals of color. And this has bore out several times across research that's been replicated, that we can look at these warmth and competence, we can put them together as high warmth or low warmth, high competence, low competence. We put them together, and that will tell us how groups are generally viewed in society. So all groups can be categorized as high or low in both of these dimensions. Now, I'm going to show you, this is from 2002. So this is sort of the foundational study for this. How long ago was that? 22 years. That's wild. 22 years ago. So you'll see that the names of the groups on this picture here are not appropriate or acceptable terms that we would use today. I'm not going to tell you which ones they are, but I think if you read some of this, you would say, oh, some of those words might make you uncomfortable to see written out. So over time, diversity language changes and it evolves to be more inclusive or more representative of what certain groups might want for themselves. So all of that is to say, this is a picture came directly from that research publication, and I'm putting it here so that you can see down here, right, groups considering individuals who are homeless, individuals who are low SES, individuals who might receive welfare or governmental assistance, they tend to all be categorized as low competence, low warmth. On the other hand, individuals that are highly educated, individuals that are professionals, generally speaking men, we rate them much higher in competence, maybe lower in warmth. Over here, individuals with disabilities, individuals that might have intellectual disabilities, elderly individuals tend to be seen as higher in warmth but lower in competence. So this sort of just shows you how these groups are differentiated in terms of perceptions among society. Many of these have remained stable over time. Some have shifted, but many have remained stable over time. And I'm mostly just showing you this so you can see how the research was conducted and how these categories were differentiated. Again, here's another example from that research. Again, not necessarily the language we might like to see or that would be deemed appropriate today, but wanting you to see how different groups kind of cluster together. And you might ask yourself whether or not these are consistent with your own perceptions, right, of your own expectations, or if you would have thought some of these groups might have been displayed differently. But more or less, the research supports these clusters, and it's supported these clusters over time. So stereotypes emerge from basic cognitive processes. So daily interactions, events, or news media can lead to stereotype formation. So we engage with individuals from a certain group based on some of our interactions, the way people are portrayed in the media, different events that occur, that forms our beliefs about the individuals within those groups. So more or less, our brain is trying to process that information, and it develops these mental shortcuts or schemas that we then use to process information about others. So stereotypes, while not always positive, don't necessarily have bad intention tied to them. Some of it is these cognitive processes that we can't control that our brain is doing for us to help us save work. And so more or less, the stereotypes are used to provide expectations about how we think other people will behave. So for instance, when I tell you, one common stereotype is that women are bad drivers, if you've ever been cut off in traffic and then you look over and you're like, oh, it's a woman, that explains it. Women are bad drivers. That is kind of how stereotypes come about, right? That's sort of how we see these stereotypes play out. Stereotypes are not necessarily linked to prejudice. So you can have a stereotype or an expectation about a group and not really have an emotional reaction or emotional feeling about that group. So we're going to next talk about prejudice and The difference between stereotypes and prejudice is that stereotypes is kind of the cognitive shortcut, the schema that we use. Prejudice elevates it to having an emotional reaction. So, prejudice is an irrational attitude of hostility directed against an individual, a group, a race, or their supposed characteristics. So, while stereotypes can be positive or negative, prejudice is always negative. There's not a positive type of prejudice. It really is this negative, irrational attitude, emotional reaction to a particular group. So there are components of prejudice. So there's the cognitive component. So these are beliefs about a group. There's the affective components. These are feelings of dislike or hostility. And then there's this behavioral component where we have a predisposition to behave negatively toward a group. So we're going to go into more explanation here on the next page. So prejudicial reactions, depending on how we view a group. So you'll see we have those warmth and competence dimensions again. So this comes from that stereotype content model. It continued to be evolved over time. So the research shows that depending on how we view a group, depending on our stereotypes about a group, it shapes our emotional and cognitive reactions to that group. So for groups that are perceived as both high in warmth and high in competence, our prejudicial reaction tends to be admiration. So feelings of pride, feelings of admiration, these are groups that we hold up in society that we think very highly of. These can also be groups to which we are part of. So our in-group, we tend to hold up with these reactions of admiring them. We talked about that last week, where we tend to have this bias, right, towards our own groups. For groups that we see as high in competence but low in warmth, these would be result in an envious prejudice. So groups of which we might be envious or jealous, maybe rich people, maybe individuals that are highly successful, maybe business people, CEOs, right? Politicians, perhaps. We put in this group to where we tend to have these envious reactions. Groups that we view as high in warmth but low in competence, so individuals with disabilities, elderly individuals, results in a paternalistic prejudice. So for these groups, we tend to elicit pity or sympathy, oftentimes when they don't need it, right? It's almost like enabling them or patronizing them a little bit, where we assume that they need our pity because they have a disability. So it's this feeling that we should offer sympathy to those individuals. And then groups that we see as low in warmth and low in competence really elicit the most negative reactions, and that's contemptuous prejudice. So we have this disgust, anger, resentment towards these groups. Oftentimes we think they're in competition with us, or we think they're taking away resources, or we perceive them to be dangerous to society, and it changes how we react towards them, oftentimes antagonistically towards them. Okay, so again, just kind of pulling the threads all together here, we can have stereotypes about groups. Those stereotypes can be positive or negative. The stereotypes are these mental shortcuts that come from interactions with individuals or how they're portrayed perhaps in society at large. Prejudice is this antagonistic, kind of negative, hostile reaction towards groups. And depending on where those groups fall, depending on the stereotypes associated with those groups, it results in these different prejudicial reactions. We can also experience bias. And so bias is a particular form of prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered to be unfair. So this week for your journal, you're going to engage in the implicit association test, the implicit bias test, where you're going to actually assess some of your own bias towards certain groups in society. And at the end of the day, we all have biases. We all have preferences towards one group or another, and it changes our reactions and how we're trying to process information about those groups. So it results in sort of an unfair advantage toward one group or the other. So again, bias is this natural preference toward or against a specific person or group. We all have biases. Nobody is without them. And so part of this course and part of our development as a professional and as a human is to recognize where our bias exists, to probe, to figure out maybe why it exists, and then to take steps to minimize the bias if we can. Or if we feel like we're unable to overcome that bias, we need to be aware of how it might impact our decision making and take steps to reduce the effect on decision making. So here, an example, low level example, but let's say a family member attends WVU. Pitt is the regional rival of WVU. Since they attend WVU, we are, this WVU family. If we see someone wearing Pitt, we decide we don't like them just based on what they're wearing. We make these unfair opinions on them based solely on them being a Pitt fan. This is the bias, right? We're biased toward WVU, so we decide we don't like the Pitt fan. We could get along well under other circumstances, but to find out, we kind of have to remove our bias. I went to Penn State. The rival against Ohio State is very real, and kind of ingrained in everything you do in that community. And so, for instance, there's someone that lives in my neighborhood now, and they have an Ohio State flag, and we walk by and you kind of groan like, oh, Ohio State, who are these people? This is a real reaction. And so it's just kind of that natural inclination to see like, oh, there's a group. It's not our preference. It goes against my preference. It goes against my group. So it's this kind of natural reaction. Now, can I get along with those neighbors? Yes. Would I do anything to harm those neighbors? No. But it's recognizing that we do have preferences for groups and for identities, and it can shape that initial kind of reaction that we have. Okay, so bias can be explicit or implicit, and that's kind of the tricky nature of bias. So explicit bias is when we are aware of it. We know that we have that bias, just like I told you about my Ohio State bias, that it operates consciously. We know it's there. Oftentimes we communicate it directly. So, oh, Ohio State, yuck. We don't like Ohio State, or can't believe you're an Ohio State fan. I really hope none of you are Ohio State fans and holding this against me. I was trying to pick a low-level example that's not too, I don't know the word for it, not too damaging, so to speak, or too personal for anyone. So if you are an Ohio State fan, please know I do value you as a student, and this is not meant to be targeted. I just wanted an example that more or less wasn't so emotional as some of the others we might encounter. Sometimes this bias is planned and organized, so we might take actions towards a particular group because we know that we don't care for them, that we have this bias and we allow it to guide our reactions. On the other hand, we might have implicit bias, and this is subconscious. We're not always aware of it. We know it, it's in our thoughts and it's affecting how we think, but we might not really know that it's there. So we can communicate this indirectly, maybe how we talk about a group or our, perspectives that we share about a group. But sometimes we think these are just observations and we don't actually recognize that we have a particular bias. And so this can be spontaneous and unplanned. In the moment, it can affect how we engage with other people. It can affect how we try to get to know other people. But again, it's not at the forefront of our mind. We don't really know why we're not communicating with somebody or getting close to somebody. And it could be a result of this bias that goes unrecognized. So explicit bias is we don't hire women for managerial positions, right? Clearly stating women aren't good managers and we're not going to hire them. On the other hand, implicit bias might be choosing a seat closer to someone of your own race. So you're making a decision, your behavior is guided by this bias you have, but you're not necessarily thinking about it when you're choosing a seat. It just guides your behavior sort of under the surface. So, reducing bias is really important. It's a process that could be lifelong, but it definitely needs to be a process that we choose to engage in. And facts alone are generally not enough to increase inclusion. So we need to consider where each person is at developmentally, what I would call a start where you stand approach. You need to recognize your own biases. Some are going to have more than others. Some biases are going to be more deep-seated, more deep-rooted than others. So you need to really take stock of where you are, kind of this self-awareness, self-analysis, and start where you're at. And then over time, training is going to become more complex as we try to navigate different types of biases, those that might be more ingrained. Some are going to be easier to overcome than others. So there's a common process for reducing bias, a common theory, and it starts, we call it the head, heart, and hand theory. You'll see the citation for it up there. But to reduce bias, we need to target 3 different areas. So the head is using knowledge, data, factual information. So we could talk about, women. We could talk about their success leading, companies and boards, their leadership ability, etc. So we can use data and facts to really try to reduce bias. Here, this is when we learn certain definitions of concepts. We might learn about the benefits of DEIA and the impact it can have on organizations. So, for instance, we know that boards that are led with mixed genders or gender identities perform better financially than firms that are only, than these boards that are led by just men or just women. So we can use these research studies, we can use facts to show these benefits of DEIA, and that can be helpful of bringing people into the conversation. We can use laws and regulations, and this is how we are expected to treat people, and this is what the law says, and guiding people sort of through these rational assessments of groups or rational assessments of DEI initiatives in general. The heart component is more about this affective, emotional component. So gaining awareness, empathy, values, this emotional understanding. So raising consideration, reevaluating, perspectives, taking on a new perspective and trying to understand how somebody might experience the workplace differently based on a certain identity. So really rooted in perspective taking. The goal is to humanize other people, right? We're all humans. We all have different challenges. We all have these different obstacles, and taking on the mindset of another person and trying to understand how they might uniquely be disadvantaged or uniquely experience the workplace. It also targets trying to find similarities. So even though we're part of different groups, what similarities do we share, and can we find some commonality? And then the hand approach is this idea that we need to reach out and, not just think and feel differently, but really engage with others. So this interpersonal interaction, trying to increase our communication skills so that we can reach out to other people. So here we might use role playing, using scripts, engaging in team building activities. And there's this idea of what we call the contact hypothesis. So the contact hypothesis states, initially, we might have bias toward a group, and then as we come to interact with these individuals, as we come to know these individuals, it shapes our perspective on those groups, and it lessens our bias towards them. This contact hypothesis was really largely brought about from the LGBTQ community and studying sexual orientation. And, back in the 90s, back in the early 2000s, there was a significant amount of stigma and bias towards LGBTQ individuals. And then as there was this movement for more individuals to come out and to discuss their sexual orientation and to share if they were gay or lesbian or bisexual, suddenly the community started to realize, oh, I actually know individuals who identify as the LGBT community, and I know these individuals, I work with them, they're in my family, they're my friends, and by having contact with these individuals, it lessened the bias. So we have to get comfortable being in an uncomfortable space and being around others who we might not initially feel comfortable being around for particular reasons, and that is really how we're going to lessen bias over time. So having 2 of the 3 of these dimensions can influence that third dimension, but really you need all 3 to be present for full inclusion. So you need to factually and logically and rationally understand why DEI is important or why we should be inclusive of a certain group. You need to have the ability to empathize and have an emotional understanding and perspective taking. and you have to be able to communicate and reach out and engage with others. So it really is, all three components are needed for full inclusion. And you might ask yourself where you stand and where you might need some direction, or for your employees, where do we start and how do we over time embrace some of these bias reductions. Another component for reducing bias was presented by Bennett, and this is more of how we develop intercultural sensitivity. And more or less, it shows that we go through these stages across time, and that with each stage, we get a little bit more sensitive towards others. We get a little bit more inclusive of others. So over time, individuals progress in their sensitivity. They become more aware. They become more open. Oftentimes, these early stages involve denial of differences or hostility towards others. And then, over time, we start to focus a little bit on similarities with acceptance of some minor differences. And then over advanced stages, we become more curious about others. We start to pursue new experiences and inclusive interactions with others. So in an organization where diversity perceptions are very, very low or very hostile, you start way at the beginning with just introducing some basic concepts, introducing what diversity is. And over time, you would build up, maybe by talking about identities, maybe doing a little fact finding, over time, trying to find similarities and building common goals and common values as an organization and as a team, and then pushing towards working together with other individuals. So it's not a quick fix. And the idea is that reducing bias takes concerted, targeted effort over time for long periods of time. And it takes a lot of self-awareness and self-motivation. Okay, so we're moving into our final component here related to discrimination. And discrimination is formally defined in an employment context when individuals, institutions, or governments treat people differently because of personal characteristics rather than their ability to perform their job. And these actions have a negative impact on access to jobs, promotions, or compensation. So because of a personal characteristic, people are treated differently. People are excluded or overlooked or fired or harassed. And obviously, those would be the negative impacts on jobs or promotions or compensation. So just as with bias, there are differences in overt versus subtle discrimination. So overt discrimination is blatant mistreatment of others, a clear intention to harm someone else. So we're going to pay men and women differently, or we are going to allow certain groups to become managers and certain groups aren't going to be managers. And we do it because we think one group is inferior or superior to another. On the other hand, subtle discrimination is when we passively mistreat people. We're clearly mistreating or treating people differently, but again, it's not always clear the reason. It can be intentional or unintentional. So it's important to recognize overt discrimination is illegal. There is no context in which overt discrimination is legally allowable or permissible. So over time, our biases might not have changed. This prejudicial feeling we have towards a group might not have changed, but the legal context about how we can treat people has changed. So we're not allowed to hang signs in our windows that say no women allowed. You can't do that. But if we feel a lot of negative hostility towards women in the workplace, we could treat them in ways that are kind of low level. They don't rise to this full legal discrimination, but they're still treating people differently. So, for instance, if we question the judgment of certain employees, make them constantly defend their rationales, make them go above and beyond to prove their point. If we regularly exclude employees from social events, so certain people are invited and certain people aren't. If we bring up stereotypes in conversations, right, that can make people feel awkward or uncomfortable, these are all ways that we can engage in subtle discrimination, whether it's intentional or not. These things aren't illegal, but they do disadvantage certain individuals. And microaggressions, which you might be aware of, these minor ways that we mistreat people on a day-to-day basis that add up over time. So, discrimination is very detrimental for employees in a variety of ways. It results in reduced performance, reduced physical health, reduced psychological health, inequity in access to mentoring and training, inequity in access to promotions. It can harm the organization if they are publicly shamed for engaging in discrimination or publicly recognized for engaging in discrimination. It can also have financial ramifications if an organization is found guilty of engaging in discrimination. It can result in some financial penalties for that organization. So it hurts individuals, it hurts organizations. There's really no benefit to engaging in discrimination. So again, discriminatory reactions, we can map out. And I just want to kind of page forward here to this warmth and competence model, because it carries through even into discriminatory reactions. So the ways in which we treat groups is going to be based on kind of the foundations of those stereotypes. So again, groups that are low in warmth and high in or low in warmth, low in competence down here, this contemptuous prejudice, right? So we have these negative reactions of disgust and anger and resentment. That's going to result in active harm, where we take steps to actively harm those individuals or try to reduce their access to certain things. On the other hand here, if we see a group as high in warmth but low in competence, those individuals that elicit pity or sympathy, we might try to help them, but we might also engage in passive harm by assuming they need our help when they don't, right? We're trying to impose ourselves on individuals like they need our help. Another group that might fit into this paternalistic prejudice would be pregnant women. So I'm a mom. I've been pregnant multiple times in the last few years, and I've experienced this in the workplace where individuals, they think you're warm, but as a pregnant person, sometimes they see you differently and they assume you need help. They assume you need their support. They assume that you can't fully carry out certain responsibilities of your job, and that's not true, right? And so that's actually harmful. It's a harmful form of discrimination. But it's coming from a good place, right? So we're trying to help individuals, we're trying to treat them with sympathy, but we're assuming they need our help when they don't, and it's a way of kind of diminishing their professional being, and it's a way of diminishing their self-worth and self-efficacy. So I just wanted to show you kind of this last page to map kind of we can carry through. Stereotypes are these mental shortcuts we have about people. Prejudice are these emotional reactions that we have towards groups. And then discrimination results in how we treat people. And we can go back here to looking at those discriminatory behaviors and classify them as either harming through insults and bullying, excluding people, or helping, trying to assist, trying to defend, trying to help other people that we can. So that gets us to the end here for our PowerPoint presentation. If you have any questions, if you want to engage in further conversation with me, please reach out. I'm happy to meet by Zoom, happy to talk over the phone. I'm happy to share some emails back and forth, but I'm really looking forward to reading your journals this week and seeing how you react to this information. How does it feel to you? What do you think about it? So as always, thanks for your engagement. Thanks for your openness to these topics, and thanks for your honesty in your journals. I've loved working through them and reading them and learning more about you all. So reach out anytime. I'm here to support you, and have a wonderful and productive week. Take care.